Welcome back to Dead Men Talking, where we revive the brightest minds in history to discuss their greatest ideas. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the founder of Claritas U, which thousands of Catholics are using to get clear and confident about their faith. Click below to learn more about Claritas U. Today, we continue our first season on opponents of Christianity, the critics. And I'm happy to welcome today Karl Marx, the German philosopher, political theorist, and revolutionary. Karl, I'm excited to welcome you here, but I must be honest, I'm also a little nervous because you're not exactly known for playing nice with religion, especially my Christianity. But at the same time, there's something about your fire, your passion, your drive to confront injustice that makes this conversation really enticing for me. So I'm excited, and thanks for joining us, and welcome, Karl.
Thank you, Brandon. I must say this whole setup is unexpected. It's surreal, frankly. Bright lights, microphones, casual banter. I imagine my reappearance in this world would involve a crowd in the streets, waving red flags, maybe some chanting, a few pamphlets flying through the air. Not this. A podcast with a Catholic. But I suppose if you're going to resurrect me, it's fitting it would be for a spirited debate. I like debate. I like conflict.
Yes, me too. Me too. I like conflict as well. So let's jump right into it. We could talk about so many of your ideas, but today on this show, I specifically want to focus on your critique of Christianity. You famously said, "Religion is the opiate of the people." And that slogan has since been endlessly quoted. It shows up on t-shirts, coffee mugs, social media bios, although often by people who haven't read the rest of your text. But I know you weren't just tossing off a slogan. So for folks who have no idea what you were really driving at, or maybe only skimmed your writings in school, can you unpack that line for us? What did you mean when you said, "Religion is the opiate of the people"?
Yes, the infamous opiate line. It's always funny to me how that little phrase became the headline of my entire critique of religion. As a side note, I have no idea what a social media bio is, or even a t-shirt for that matter. But you're right, people rarely bother with the rest of the thought, which is far more nuanced. The full context is important. After comparing religion to opium, I say religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of our soulless conditions. I was not dismissing religion. I wasn't sneering at people who believe. I was trying to explain why they believe, why religion persists in a world that seems so often unjust. My argument was this. People turn to religion not because they're stupid, but because they're suffering. It's a response to pain, to despair, to exploitation. And religion, in many cases, helps in the same way as opium. It eases the pain. It gives people a reason to carry on. But like opium, it doesn't heal the source of the pain. It doesn't fix the conditions. It just numbs you to them. My concern was that religion lulled people into accepting misery instead of changing it. It was less a condemnation of faith than a condemnation of the world that makes people cling to faith to survive.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. And I think a lot of folks, especially Christians, miss it. They hear you say that religion is a drug, and they assume that you're bashing God and bashing faith. But when you put it that way, I can at least see the human concern underneath. You were focused on suffering and how people deal with it. And in some ways, I get that. Some forms of religion can be escapist. That's true. In fact, there's a version of faith that tells people, don't worry about your circumstances. Just keep your head down, say your prayers, and everything will be fine after you die. That's a real temptation, and it's been abused, especially by those in power. But Karl, that's not how I see Christianity, at least not the real thing. Christianity is not a spiritual sedative. It's actually more like a defibrillator, an electric shock, something that jolts people awake. Christianity doesn't whisper, "Shh, everything will be okay." Instead, it shouts, "Get up and act." Jesus very clearly called us to care for the poor, to challenge injustice, forgive our enemies, love sacrificially. And perhaps we can go deeper into this later, but historically, some of the most profound social movements, including the movement for workers' rights, have been led by deeply religious people. So if Christianity is a drug, it's not one that sedates you. It's one that wakes you up, that makes you get out of bed and march in the streets.
Well, Brandon, I've heard that defense before, and I sympathize with it. There are parts of religion, even Christianity, that sound somewhat revolutionary. Your man Jesus talked about the rich going away empty and the poor inheriting the kingdom. That's not bad. But what I saw in my life again and again was religion being used to justify the status quo. To tell poor workers, don't worry about your suffering now, your reward is in heaven. That's deeply dangerous. It tells people to endure rather than resist.
Well, you're not completely wrong, Karl. I'll admit that Christianity has been co-opted many times throughout history. Kings, emperors, even slave owners quoting the Bible to keep people in chains and to dominate them. But again, that's not Christianity at its best. That's a twisted version of it. And after all, let's be fair, the same thing happened with your ideas. They were twisted and used by evil men. I mean, the 20th century, which I know you didn't live to experience, but it was full of examples of your disciples, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, who used your philosophy to justify horrific violence, including forced atheism, gulags, and genocide. In fact, some scholars say that during the 20th century, upwards of 100 million deaths can be attributed to communist regimes. Now, does that mean that your own ideas were necessarily wrong, or were they just misused?
Fair point, Brandon. You're right to bring that up. And I've wrestled with that myself. I didn't call for gulags. I didn't write blueprints for secret police. I described the problems of capitalism and the need for a better system. Others took those ideas and ran off a cliff with them. And, well, that's tragic. But it's not the same as a flaw in the core philosophy. Let me be clear. I wasn't naive about power. I never imagined that change would come bloodlessly. Revolutions are messy. You don't get to reshape entire systems without disruption. But the goal, liberation from economic exploitation, was always central. The tragedy, of course, is when the tools of liberation turn into tools of domination. Stalin, Mao, they created a new ruling class, a new elite. That's not what I called for. I envisioned a classless society where power was shared, not concentrated. A place where workers wouldn't be cogs in someone else's machine, but co-creators of their own destiny. That vision, I still believe, holds merit. Yet again, let's not pretend Christianity has clean hands either. For centuries, Christianity was used to bless monarchies, justify crusades, and excuse slavery. The cross and the sword were often all too cozy. So, the misuse of ideas isn't a Marxist problem. It's a human one. But the ideals themselves deserve to be examined fairly. That's what we should focus on. Therefore, let's turn back to the bigger picture. I believe that to really free humanity, we must transform the material conditions of life. When we change the base, the economic structure, everything else follows. Culture, politics, even religion.
Sure, but that's exactly where I think you went off course. You saw man as primarily economic, as a producer and a consumer. But we're more than that. We're spiritual beings, not just economic creatures. We're not just hungry for bread, we're hungry for meaning, for transcendence. And that hunger for meaning often drives our actions even more than economics. Now, I'm not downplaying the importance of material justice, far from it, but I think your framework doesn't fully account for the soul, for that part of us that longs for something beyond productivity, beyond class struggle. You see all sorts of oppression and suffering among workers, and you're right, that's real and it's still real today. But there's also a deeper suffering, namely alienation from God, from our Creator. To me, that's the deepest wound of all. Even if you fix the economy, people will still ache for something more.
I agree, meaning is important. But we can create meaning. We don't need a supernatural sky father to give it to us. We make meaning together, through work, through community, through building a just society.
Well, but that only works if you have some shared vision of the good. After all, your vision of a just society and the Christian vision for a just society are significantly different. So, which just society should we be working toward? We need to agree on the goal before discussing the best ways to get to that goal. And I'd argue that you can't really ground that without something transcendent. Otherwise, what's to stop the powerful from simply redefining justice in their favor? What's stopping the strong and the powerful from shaping society according to their best interests?
But, Brendan, that's what they do now, with religion backing them.
Maybe sometimes, yes, but not always. The church has always been a thorn in the side of power. Look at Paul taunting Caesar, or popes standing up to corrupt emperors, or the Catholic underground today in China. Christianity isn't just a tool of the powerful. It often resists the strong and the powerful while fighting for the weak and the vulnerable.
But again, those are the outliers. More often than not, religion serves as the mortar in the walls of oppression. It makes inequality feel sacred. As the controversial hymn puts it, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. Christianity claims that everyone's social positions have been ordained by God, and they should be content.
Yeah, that hymn, I think it's called All Things Bright and Beautiful, didn't age too well, did it? But Christianity actually teaches that every person is made in the image of God. This is radical. It means that the beggar on the street has infinite worth. And if we took that seriously, we'd see a revolution unlike anything in your manifesto.
Well, it's an inspiring thought, Brandon. I'll give you that. But you and I just seem to have different starting points. For you, it's human dignity, rooted in divine likeness. For me, it's the material reality of lived experience. The factory worker doesn't need a sermon about his worth. He needs a living wage, decent hours, and a system that doesn't chew him up and spit him out. You speak of spiritual hunger. I speak of stomachs that are literally empty, right now, today. I'm not hostile to dignity. But what good is dignity when you can't afford rent? When your children are sick and there's no doctor who will see them because you can't pay? It's easy to talk about image of God theology when you're not crushed under the weight of economic despair. That's why I insisted on starting with the base, the economic structure that determines whether people live or die.
Well, if I can shift the discussion a little bit, I wanted to talk with you about one of my personal heroes, Dorothy Day. Whenever I hear your name or think about your ideas, it's hard for me to do so without thinking of Dorothy. She was born in 1897, so not too long after you died, about 14 years after you died. But Dorothy was the real deal. She was a firebrand, a radical in every sense of the word, and she was actually quite taken with you. She read the Communist Manifesto in her early 20s, and she wrote for socialist newspapers. She joined labor protests. She was even arrested during a demonstration. Dorothy marched in the streets, and for a while she genuinely believed that Marxism, your philosophy, held the key to alleviating the suffering that she saw all around her, especially among poor workers. But in 1927, when she was 30 years old, she surprised many of her friends and fellow activists when she converted to Catholicism. Now, what's interesting about her conversion is that she didn't abandon all of her earlier convictions, she baptized them. She didn't stop caring about the poor or exploited workers. She brought that passion for justice, that love for the poor, that fire for labor reform into the heart of the church. And then her Christianity amplified all of those concerns. Dorothy co-founded something called the Catholic Worker Movement during the Great Depression with her friend Peter Marin. And she lived in voluntary poverty. She shared her table and her home with the homeless. She protested against war, inequality, and injustice. She was arrested several more times. So Dorothy saw clearly all the problems of society, just as you do. However, she no longer believed that economic revolution was the best solution. Dorothy discovered that any effective remedy had to be grounded in God and would need to involve a healing of the soul, both individual souls and the soul of society. She saw the answer in the teachings of Christ, especially his Sermon on the Mount, and the social teachings of the Catholic Church, especially those of Pope Leo XIII. For Dorothy and her co-founder, Peter Marin, the social teachings of the church were like dynamite that scholars had wrapped up nicely and placed in hermetic containers and then sat on the lid so it wouldn't leak out. But Dorothy wanted to unleash those teachings, to live them out and allow them to explosively transform the world.
Well, I wish I had met this Dorothy. She sounds like someone I would respect. One who actually took her convictions seriously and acted on them. She would have been an excellent comrade.
Well, to be honest, Karl, I think she would have made you proud, but also a little uncomfortable. She wrestled with your writings. In fact, she once called your critique of capitalism brutally accurate. However, she thought that you underestimated the human heart and that you overestimated what a purely economic revolution could accomplish. And to your point earlier, she didn't view faith as a kind of personal escape hatch. It was definitely not opiate of the people. For her, faith was not private or detached. It was about concrete action. The works of mercy, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, standing shoulder to shoulder with laborers. She said, it's one of my favorite quotes, what we would like to do is change the world, make it a little simpler for people to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves. In fact, it sounds kind of like something you might have written.
And yet you're telling me she remained committed to the Catholic Church? That surprises me. With all the Church's ties to power, wealth, and tradition, how did she reconcile that with her radical convictions?
Yes, she remained a devoted Catholic. Now, of course, Dorothy never pretended the church was perfect. Far from it. She saw all the church's warts and failures, but she loved the church like you love a deeply flawed family. You love your family fiercely, but not blindly. And that was Dorothy's relationship to the church. Dorothy was constantly calling the church to live up to its own teachings, to be less aligned with the empire and more aligned with the poor. In fact, she said the church is both the bride of Christ and a harlot at times, a prostitute. And yet she stayed committed because for her, the church was the place where she met Jesus, and Jesus was always found in the poor.
Well, Brendan, it's rare to find someone who can hold that much tension. Most people either abandon their ideas or their institutions. So she saw religion not as the opiate, but as, what? A stimulant?
Yeah, something like that. For Dorothy and for all the saints of Christianity, religion is not a sedative. It's not opium. It's more like fuel. Dorothy's belief in God didn't make her passive. It made her active and it made her dangerous. toward the end of her life, she fasted in solidarity with farm workers and she picketed nuclear test sites. So that's definitely not a woman who was sedated.
Very interesting. I'll admit, if religion produced more Dorothy Days, maybe I'd have to write fewer pages. Still, I'd argue she's the exception, not the rule. For every Dorothy Day, there are 1,000 comfortable pew-sitters who say grace over their steak dinners and ignore the cries from the street or the beggars at the proverbial gate.
Well, I don't deny that, and I won't defend complacency, but I do think Dorothy is more than an exception. I think she's a sign of what Christianity can be when it's taken seriously. Not a relic, not a crutch, but a revolution of love. And I'd argue that changes society more than laws because it changes hearts. You can restructure the economy, but if people are still selfish, still greedy, still hungry for power, then you're just shuffling deck chairs around. Christianity wants to go deeper. It wants to go all the way down to convert the soul and not just the system. So the Christian answer is not, well, just wait for heaven. No, the Christian answer is bring heaven to earth. In his famous prayer, Jesus didn't say, escape the world. He said, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. That means here on earth, we feed the hungry, we clothe the naked, we visit the prisoner now, not later. Well, listen, Karl, this was honestly one of my favorite conversations. I appreciate your honesty, your challenge, and your passion for justice most of all.
And thank you, Brandon. You're not what I expected. A Catholic who fights like a revolutionary. I can work with that.
Well, I'll gladly work with you on that too. Workers unite. Again, thanks for joining me, Karl, and thanks to all of you for watching, and we'll see you next time here on Dead Men Talking. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Dead Men Talking, sponsored by Claritas U. Before we wrap up, I want to tell you a little more about Claritas U. Claritas U is an online platform that I created several years ago designed to help you discuss your Catholic faith with clarity and confidence, especially when it comes to hot-button issues. If you've ever struggled to explain your faith to a family member, a friend, or coworker, Claritas U is for you. Nearly 10,000 Catholics have joined, and they're all becoming experts on the tough topics that everyone is talking about, including IVF, abortion, atheism, evil and suffering, transgenderism, the Eucharist, a whole lot more. There are separate video courses on each of these topics, including courses on how to draw people back to the church after they've drifted away. In fact, we have over 40 video courses inside there for you. On each topic, you'll learn all the wisdom of the church, how to answer the top objections to the Catholic view, and more importantly, exactly how to communicate that wisdom with clarity and confidence, how to be a more compelling Catholic. Each video course also features expert interviews with leading Catholic voices such as Father Mike Schmitz, Dr. Peter Kraft, Dr. Brant Petrie, and more, giving you their best tips and advice on how to share your faith in today's culture. So tons of exciting things await you inside of Claritas U. Just click the link below to join. I look forward to seeing you inside, and even more back here for the next episode of Dead Men Talking. God bless you.